to the next instalment in this video mini-series where we are collaborating with leasehold expert Bernie Wales, and we're focusing on different leasehold FAQs. And for today's instalment, Bernie, we're going to talk about the actual length of a lease, because it's very, very important for buy-to-let landlords to understand this, because it can have an impact on lending. As we've previously discussed, it's quite challenging to get a mortgage on a lease that's less than 80 years. So when a landlord can see their lease running down, they need to think about extending the lease. And you're going to talk us through the process.
Indeed, yes. The length is always very important, and 80 years is a sort of big trigger point, because the way that an extension premium is valued, it either includes or excludes marriage value in the formula, and that kicks in at exactly the 80-year unexpired term. So I hate it when people come to me and say, I've got 79 years and 11 months. You know, quite often people don't realize until it is too late. So if people don't take anything else away from this, is go and check your lease and see how much unexpired time you've got, and then diarize it. I tend to put a list down at the end of each calendar year to go and review each of them, because time goes by. So if you have got a property that you're buying, or you want to remortgage, and you've got more than, let's say, 85 years unexpired, then you're not going to run into any remortgage problems at all, I would suggest. If you're in that sort of 80 to 85 year period, then you ought to consider a lease extension before you remortgage. If you're under the 80 year mark, then an extension would be good, and the longer you leave it, the more it's going to cost you. Let me skip through the way that it's done, first of all, and then come back to buy-to-let landlords in particular. So try and remind me, Vanessa. So if you want to get a lease extension, then there are two ways of doing it: the commercial way and the statutory way. The commercial way is to speak to your landlord or the managing agent for the landlord and ask. Some landlords are responsive and are used to doing it, and they may have a range of options available to you. And that's always worth checking out. You know, you may not need an additional 90 years. You may just want to extend up to 99 years or back up to 125 years. You may be quite happy to pay a little bit of ground rent. So you can do a deal in terms of, well, I'll pay some ground rent and I'll pay less for the extension. I would say give that a try. If you get somewhere and there is steady progress, and you get to a point where you can do that process and instruct solicitors and get to the point where you exchange on that or do the deal quickly, and I would say 4 to 6 weeks for getting through that, then great. But if you get a nice start and they talk to you and you agree something, and then it goes to the solicitors and then it doesn't quite happen, then you need to go down the statutory route. Alternatively, you could start down the statutory route anyway. And the way to do that is to get a solicitor to serve a Section 42 notice. And that's Section 42 of the Leasehold Reform Housing and Urban Development Act 1993. Kind of a mouthful, that one. Section 42 notice is what you need. And it has to be prepared really by a leasehold specialist solicitor, because it is a prescribed form, and you've got to get all of the I's dotted, T's crossed. The information has got to be absolutely perfect. Otherwise, the landlord will claim that it's not a valid notice and they won't start the process. But if you do serve that satisfactorily, then a timetable kicks in and you go through the valuation process. You have to cover the landlord's costs of dealing with your notice, which is principally their solicitor and their valuer. a price is agreed between the two valuers if they don't accept the price you've put forward, and then the deal is done. There is a timetable for that, and if the two valuers can't agree, or you can't agree an extension premium with the landlord, then you can apply to the first tier tribunal and have them determine what that premium should be. And that's normally a paper determination. So you send in your calculations, the landlord sends in theirs, and the tribunal will do it without a hearing. Because there's probably not a lot to discuss. It's all percentages and yield rates and deferment rates and things like that. So that's the way to do it. There are online calculators you can look at. Leasehold Advisory Service has got one. There are other ones if you Google. And they, whilst they won't give you a premium to the penny, what they will do is tell you whether it's going to be 10 grand or 100 grand. You know, it gives you a ballpark figure so you know roughly what you're looking at. You also need to add in those costs. So I would generally allow £5,000 for both sides' costs in doing the process. So you need to do that if you've got a mortgage in place, remortgaging, or you're looking to mortgage. But of course, a buy-to-let landlord, and this is the bit not everybody thinks about, may not need to do that. You may not extend, carry on with your depreciating lease for the next 80 years, take your profit, not spend that money, just take your profit out of the rent, and in theory, at the end of the lease, give the flat back. I mean, frankly, we're not going to be here in 80 years' time, and I would imagine most of the viewers here aren't going to be. But it is something to consider from a commercial business point of view. Do I spend this 10 grand, 15 grand, 20 grand, or whatever it is out of my profit, or do I just carry on and use that 10, 15, 20 grand for something else, another flat perhaps, or something like that? Whilst the conventional wisdom out there is, yes, get an extension so you can get a better mortgage, I would always say, well, consider, well, what if I don't? Might be worth considering.
It's interesting you say that, Bernie. I've done a lease extension recently on a flat in London that had dropped below 80 years. And I didn't take your good advice and have a record of when the lease was declining. And I got a little bit caught out by that. So I've learnt my lesson. But interestingly enough, I went the first method that you described. I went straight to the management company. I had to pay a small fee. I think it was £120 to get a lease extension pack. And the freeholder landlord came back to me with an offer. I negotiated on that, and we reached an agreement. And what I was just going to add, Bernie, was that the lender that I wanted to remortgage with, there were sufficient funds in the remortgage to actually pay for the lease extension, and they agreed to me completing on the remortgage and the lease extension on the same day. So I just wanted to add that into the mix if there are some landlords who are thinking, oh crikey, you know, I might need to come up with 30, 40k for a lease extension. But the other thing to say, Bernie, is if the lease does decline and you do decide to sell the property with a very shortened lease, then obviously the value of the property is going to be significantly less, but then you'll have a less capital gain. So I think you're right to just ask these questions prior to going for a lease extension.
Yes, indeed. And the other thing that you may decide to do is, if you are coming to sell the flat, is that you start that Section 42 process on behalf of your buyer, and then they continue those negotiations with your landlord, and then you can complete your sale, their purchase, at the same time as the lease extension, and they can put their mortgage attached to the extended lease. Or you could do the process and then sell for a higher sum, etc. So there's a number of different wrinkles to it, I suppose. The other thing I think that would be worth thinking about, looking a little bit to the future, is leasehold reform. That is coming along. We don't quite know when it's going to arrive, but there's a whole raft of changes. And some of the ones that are proposed which relates to extensions is that they are proposing to change the statutory additional 90 years, 90 years, to a statutory 990 years. So a much bigger extension. Now, they haven't given us any useful information like, well, what's that going to cost and what's the formula? They've said they're going to change the formula, but they haven't told us what. I would say you're not going to get 900 additional years for free, but you may get a much better extension with the leasehold reform that comes along. Now, the other thing that is there at the minute and will be there in the future is that with the statutory extension, it changes the ground rent to a peppercorn, legally zero. What's going to happen from, I think it's going to be January or February, when the leasehold reform brackets, ground rents, close brackets, limited, Act comes in. It's had its second reading. It's going to be probably January, February, is that is saying that ground rent cannot be charged on all new leases. And that will include any lease extension. The statutory already says ground rent will be a peppercorn, but if you do a commercial, you can agree to pay ground rent. That won't be possible once that ground rent bill becomes a ground rent act, and ground rent will disappear on any lease extension. So keep an eye open on Property Tribes and on my website for leasehold reform and how that affects this subject and other buy-to-let situations.
Indeed. Well, that's really, really helpful information, Bernie. So many things for landlords to consider when it comes to lease extensions. And these are the kind of things that Bernie advises on with his leasehold advisory consultancy work. And Bernie has collaborated with Property Tribes, and you can download Bernie's free ebook, which is a really important ebook for any landlord involved in leasehold property, and that is How to Read Your Lease, and we will put the link to that under this video. But for now, Bernie, thank you for this instalment, and we'll see you on the next video.
Great, thanks.